This is Mishnah in Depth, Menachot with Rabbi Joshua Kulp. This is our third class of 5 series. Welcome back after our brief break. I will post sources in chat once Rabbi Kulp gets teaching. These are the same sources as for the previous 2 sessions. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rabbi Kulp.
All right. So the material, this is very hard material if you haven't noticed. Menachot is not easy. It's very technical. It's like it feels very informational.
Yes.
It's just like this is what you do, this is what you do, this is what you do, as opposed to like something like Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, which is like lots of debates and svar on logic and things like that. This is like it's highly informational, which makes it, I gotta be frank, a little challenging to teach. It's just like lists of this is how you do it and this is how you do it. But I'll give it a shot. I think what we're going to do is we only have 2 more classes. We've got today and we've got in 2 weeks. During Chol Hamoed Sukkot, we're not meeting. So in 2 weeks, I'm going to do the chapter. I think the best chapter, we'll save the best for last, is about the Omer. That's the 10th chapter. So we're going to save that.
That's what we're learning now. I mean, we just started now.
We just started now. Okay, so we're not going to teach, I'm not going to teach that today. This way you'll have a chance to go over it. I think that's the most interesting stuff. We'll save that for in 2 weeks. So you'll go over it. So it'll be a little less fresh, but Beseder. And now we're going to, I think I'm going to start with chapter 5. We'll see where we get. If there's something, some of it, if it's just too highly just information, I might do a little bit of skipping today. And wherever we get to today, we'll get to, and what we don't cover, we don't cover. That's just the way it goes. All right, let me open up the screen share. Let's start with chapter 5, which gives, I think the beginning of chapter 5 is a little fun, then there's some drier stuff. Kol hamenachot ba'ot matzah. Generally speaking, mincha offerings are not leavened, right? There's a pasuk I brought over here. Kol mincha asher takrivu la'Hashem lo te'aseh chametz. Don't make any of your menachot chametz. Ki kol seor v'chol dvash lo taktiru mimenu isher la'Hashem. Don't offer any korbanot, any haktarot offerings that are either have in them leaven, seor, or dvash, or honey, which is also like a fermentable kind of object. Right. My best guess, I mean, we don't really know exactly why, but my best guess is that like fermenting is essentially a way of going bad, right? There's a very thin line between something fermenting and something spoiling, right? Essentially fermenting is spoiling. So you shouldn't put spoiled kinds of things, bad things, onto the altar, onto the Mizbeach. And so dvash and seor, honey and leaven are off limits. However, there are a couple menachot that do have, that are leavened, right? And those don't go on the altar, but they are menachot. Not all menachot, most menachot go onto the altar, but not all of them, right?
But isn't it true that honey doesn't spoil? I mean, they have honey from thousands of years ago. Honey is one of the few foods that lasts forever.
But are we talking date honey or are we talking honey from bees?
Matter. I think most honey is bees honey, and the stam honey is Dvi's honey in the
But I think honey, and what honey are they talking about here? I really don't know.
Assuming they're talking about date honey, not date honey, bee honey.
Oh, they are?
I don't know, bees, I don't know. I don't know if you leave it there. I don't know. You know, if stuff gets into honey, it starts to, I mean, you use honey is used to make alcohol. It was commonly used to make alcohol, but so is grain. As grain's used to make alcohol also. So, of course, are grapes used to make alcohol. I don't know. I don't know why dvash is not used on the altar. It is fermentable, but as I just said, other items that do go on the altar are also fermentable, namely wine, right, is also
right,
and wine goes bad. So I don't know. Maybe because I've learned it so much, it seems intuitive, but once you know something, then you just think it makes sense, but then you ask yourself, why does it make sense? And you don't have such a great answer. All right. The only 2 examples of chametz are chametz shebetodah. This is the chametz there. We'll see. We'll get to this later on. I think we'll get to it today, maybe in chapter 7. But with the todah, the Thanksgiving offering, there are 40 different kinds of loaves or menachot brought, and 10 of them are chametz. right? That's explicitly in the pasuk. That's here in Vayikra Zayin Yud Gimel. Al chalot chametz lechem chametz yakriv korbano. Al zevach todah shlamav. So for a zeva, a sacrifice of a todah, which is a time of shlamim, you bring chametz with it. The chametz doesn't go on the altar though. Chametz never goes on the altar. So, but the chametz is eaten there by the priests. Okay, the chametz loaves. That's we'll see later on 10 loaves. And the other one is the shtei halechem, the two loaves that go along with Shavuot on Atzeret. Right, that's the mimosh v'teichem taviu lechem tznufa. It's waved. Shtayim, two of them. Right, two loaves of bread. Shnei esronim solet tiena chametz te'afena bikurim laHashem. Okay, those are the only two exceptions. Oh, here we go. Kiwi. See here, someone else here from Mishnah. You here? Let me just make sure I see everyone. Oh, I didn't see him. All right, I don't know if he popped in. Okay. Oh, there's Kiwi. All right. Yes, the Daf Shui. We get some crossover people. Everybody, Rebecca and Kiwi are regular Daf Shui. Debbie's a regular Mishnah person. It's great. Kibbutz Galuyot here, right? Everybody from all over the place. We've got Canada, America, Israel, New York, Chicago, lots of places. That's good. Okay, so now the question is, how do you leaven these offerings, these menachot that are leavened? The problem with leaven is, like, if you made sourdough, sometimes it bubbles over, or sometimes it would reduce. So we're gonna have this problem of, if you need to have an exact measure of grain that goes into your chametz offering, how do you get the leaven? So there's two different opinions here. Rabbi Meir Omer seor bodel lahen mitochan umechamsan. So Rabbi Meir would say you would, whatever the measure you're using for your mincha, you would take the leaven, the seor, out of it, and you would let it leaven a little bit, and then you would leaven the rest of it. This way you'd have the exact measure, right? Because if you put in shnei esronim, right, 2/10 of an ephah, then you take some out, turn it into leaven, and then put it back in. This way you're left with the exact amount of grain. Rabbi Yehuda Omer afi eina mina muvchar. The problem with that is, like, it's not necessarily, I'm not sure of the timing here, but it's not going to create well leavened loaves, because leavening takes some time, and it's better, right? Starter dough was something that was like a continuous process, right? Some of you might have those jars, and you just continue to grow and your leaven perpetually. And to use old leaven is a much better way of leavening bread than new leaven. This is a problem that comes up with Pesach in the Gemara all the time. So what does he do? Ela mevi et haseor, right? So he would bring the leavening, v'noten letoch hamidan, put it into the measuring cup, and then umemale et hamidah with regular, the measuring cup with regular non-leavened grain. Okay, so this way you would have the exact measurement, but you get better seor, you'd get better leavening. Amrulo afhi hayta chasera o yetera. The problem is that would cause it to, if it was good leaven, it's going to bubble over, and you're going to end up with more, like a bigger measure than you're supposed to. And if it's bad leaven, you're going to end up with less of a measure, right? So there's a little bit of a conflict about how to keep the precise measure without, and still get as best bread as possible. Okay. Kol ha-menachot niroshot poshrin u'meshamran shelo yachmitzu. So all menachot are they're kneaded with tepid water. So the warmer, if it's warm water, right? If you've made recipes with leaven before with yeast, you're better off using warm water. Warm water will ferment quicker than cold water. So I don't think they could get really cold water, right? They didn't, in Eretz Israel, before refrigeration, I would imagine cold water was not something they would really have all that often, unless you could, like in the winter. And you would dig it deep from under the ground. But for the most part in the Middle East, cold water was hard to have. So you use not hot water, but you would use as cold water as you possibly could, because that arrests the leavening. Right? And this is referring to a regular not the leavened one, right? Bread is going to leaven if you just leave it, right? So you can find this in Psachim as well, in Mishnah Psachim as well, that when you're kneading bread, how did they make sure that it didn't become leavened? One way was to use not warm water, to use as cold water as possible. V'im hichmitzu, if they did turn into leaven, shayareha, the extra stuff, not the stuff. For most menachot, there's two things. There's a kometz, a handful put onto the altar, and then you've got the rest that is eaten usually by the kohanim. Right. So if the remainder becomes chametz, over below ta'aseh. Shene'emar, it's a negative commandment. We transgress a negative commandment. Kol hamincha asher takrivu Hashem lo ta'aseh chametz. All of the mincha, not just that goes on the altar. Right. Maybe there's like what you might have thought is what's really important is that stuff doesn't go onto the altar. But even the rest of it, obviously you can't put chametz onto the altar. That's explicit. But even if the stuff that someone's going to eat becomes chametz, that still transgresses a negative commandment because kol hamincha, it's not just kol mincha, but kol hamincha. Every part of the mincha can't become chametz except for those two exceptions. V'chayavin al rishata ve'al richata ve'al afiyata. So if it becomes leavened, now there's three possible averot, like times in which you would transgress by manipulating or treating it as a kosher mincha, both the kneading, the arranging, and the baking, right? Any of those acts with the remainder is going to transgress a negative commandment, not just one of them, but all of them. Okay. All right. The next sort of set of mishnayot is, it's like the form is interesting. It's a very much one of these ones that like compares all the different menachot, right? One of the things that's difficult about this whole masechet is that there's a lot of different menachot with a lot of different minutia of rules. And you are not the only ones having trouble keeping them all in mind, right? I think that I have trouble keeping them all in mind, and the rabbis probably assumed that most people had trouble keeping everything in order, and therefore have like broader like rules of thumb to try to keep, to remember and sort of to group them together, because there really are a lot of different menachot which have most of the same things in common, but not everything in common. Right? If they were all exactly the same, this would be an easy masechet. But the minutia of differences makes it all very, very complicated. All right, so here's the first thing. Yesh tunot shemen ulevona, shemen velo levona, levona velo shemen, lo shemen velo levona. So this is all about the oil and the incense, the frankincense, right? So sometimes they require both, sometimes they require neither, and sometimes they require one and not the other, which is like kind of cool, I think, in the Mishnaic mind that you have all four possibilities, right? Anything's possible, but it does make it a little more complicated. Okay, ve'elu tilnot shemen ulivona, right? The following require both shemen and the frankincense. Okay. Some of the psukim are over here just for an example. And sometimes the rabbis, like in Vayikra, especially in Perek Bet, it doesn't give all the details for every single pasuk. So what the rabbis do is sometimes say that one pasuk refers to not just its specific detail, but things that come later as well. So the very beginning of that perek, which is all about the mincha, v'nefesh ki takriv korban mincha la'Hashem, so it yeh korbano, v'yatzak aleha shemen, v'natan aleha levona. So all of those ones that are listed there, I think there's 5, they all require both oil and levona. Okay, and then you get some of the different kinds. Ve'elu tunot shemen ulevona. These ones require oil and incense. Minchat hasolet, mechavat, marcheshet, va'acharot, ve'rikikim. That's the 5 that are there in Vayikra 2, chapter 2, right? Flour offering, pan, griddle or griddle pan, cakes and thin cakes. Minchat kohanim, right? That's a special offering because it's all burnt on the altar. Minchat Kohen HaMashiach, that's the one that's done twice a day, split up morning and evening. Minchat Goyim means just a mincha brought by a non-Jew. Non-Jews can offer voluntary sacrifices, right? There's a lot of information about that. They can offer a mincha. It has the same rules as a regular mincha for the most part. Minchat Nashim, in case you thought that like women, maybe you might have thought that there's a different rule for korbanot brought by women than by men. There is not, at least not for this issue. It's the same as for men. And minchat ha'omer, also the omer, which is, did I bring that down here? I think I brought it somewhere. But the omer mincha also requires oil and frankincense. Oh, here, it's here. This is Vayikra 2:14, which the rabbis think refers to the omer. Takriv minchat bikurim, right? The first fruits offering, which sounds like the omer. And then the next verse is v'natat alea shemen, v'samt alea levona, right? That requires an omer. The omer offering also requires oil and levona. Minchat nechasim. So minchat nesachim is the mincha that goes with animal korbanot. Right, there's in all of these, we read these for like the musaf. Whenever we read the musaf, there's always umin chatav nisacheha, right, or something like that, right? Those are the extra libations that accompany animal offerings. Those require oil. There's no frankincense mentioned in those verses, so there's no incense. Lechem hapanim, there I brought in Vayikra 24, there's the lechem hapanim, the showbread. That requires livona, but no shemen. Be'ein talun shemen. So it says there, v'natata al ha'marechet livona zakah, pure frankincense, but there's no shemen mentioned in those verses. So the showbread is with water, but no shemen. Right. By the way, the water, the Gemara never really, the Mishnah never really talks about the water, but there is water. If you're making bread, you can't make bread without water. But sometimes if you wanted to make like a pancake kind of mixture, that they can make without water. You can just like fry dough. I think most of the time when we today make fried dough, we also add water. It just probably makes it tastier. But they have some menachot don't have water and some do. The general rule of thumb, I think, is that if it's bread, then it has water in it, and if it's not bread, it doesn't have water. But that might not be 100%. Shtei halechem, that's the two loaves that go with the for Shavuot. Minchat choteh. Right, this is a good chazara, by the way, if you want to memorize. Like, there's no tests here at the end, but if you wanted to memorize all of the menachot, the minchat choteh is the one where a person who's bringing a chatat can bring an animal, a bird, or a mincha, or a mincha. That's the lowest one. So if he's bringing a mincha, that's the minchat choteh, the chatat mincha. Minchat knaot is the for the sota, right? The jealousy mincha, lo shemen velo livona, which kind of makes sense, right? These are unadorned, right? Therefore, sins or suspected sins. So there's no shemen and no livona, and that says there explicitly. This is just straightforward in the Mikra. And about the minchat chotet, lo yasim alea shemen velo yiten alea livona ki chatatu. Right? You don't adorn a chatat. And the same thing goes for the sota, lo yitzok alav shemen velo yitain alav levona. Straightforward in the verses. Okay. Ve'chayav al hashemen bifnei atzmo ve'al halevona bifnei atzma. So both of those, right? If you were to add them to an offering that doesn't require them, you've done two transgressions, not one transgression. Rabbis love to figure out how many transgressions you've done for whatever reason. That's something that they like to talk about. So there's for that case. Natan aleha shemen psara levona yokatena. So what if you put it on? If you put shemen onto one of these grain offerings, you're not supposed to put it on. You've disqualified it because you can't get shemen out of something, right? Unfortunately, some of my favorite pairs of pants have suffered from that problem. a little bit of shemen falls on them, and no matter what I do, I cannot get the shemen stain out of them. It is very sad to me when this happens. I'm sure I'm not the only person in the world. So just like my pants have been pasul, so too your mincha is pasul if you spill some shemen on it. But with some frankincense, like if you spill some, I don't know, salt or pepper on your pants, you can just take it off. And the same thing with the mincha. Probably the first person to compare the mincha with a pair of pants. But, helpful analogy. Natan, it really makes me so upset when I'm sitting there at dinner or something and like, I don't know, piece of pizza. And my wife laughs at me or my sisters laugh at me and they all have a good time. Natan shemen al shiarea eno over below ta'aseh. Right. So the remainders, right? The most important part is not to put it on the komets that's going onto the altar, into the handful, right? If you put something onto the remainders after you already offered the komets, the handful, you shouldn't do it, but it's not a transgression because once the komets is already gone, it's like the process is sort of over, right? And it's not the essential part. Natan kli al gabe kli lo pisala. A little bit confusing here, but it seems to be talking about if you put a vessel with shemen on top of the vessel with mincha in it, because it's not falling onto it, you haven't disqualified it. Al, right? Lo yasim aleha shemen doesn't mean like on top of it, but not touching it. It means into it, right? The word al can mean different things. To be honest, I'm not sure why I would have thought that I would puzzle a mincha in one vessel by putting a vessel of oil in the air space of it if it's not touching. But maybe there's a hava amina, what you might have thought if it wasn't for this Mishnah. So don't think that. Okay, moving on to the second topic, right? The form here, you can see very like similar kinds of form. Yesh tunot shemen velevona ba ba ba. And now you get the same thing with two other things. Yesh tunot hagasha, vein tunot tznufa, tznufa velo hagasha, hagasha utznufa, lo tznufa velo hagasha. All four possibilities. What are hagasha and tznufa? Hagasha is bringing the mincha close to the altar. That's part of most processes of sacrificing. And tznufa is the waving, right? The Mishnah is going to explain how we wave. It's good. It's a little. It's good that we have a little waving because that's what we do essentially with the lulav, right? The lulav is essentially waved, right? Although it's not mentioned, that's not mentioned there in the Torah. It's not exactly the same thing, but it feels a little similar that like the lulav when you wave. My lulav is coming in a couple hours, so I'm very excited about that. Okay. Elu tunot hagasha, ve'enan tunot tznufa. So the following, there's no tznufa. Tznufa is unusual, the waving. Hagasha is usual. So I'm not going to go through all of these. It's minchat solet, machabat, marcheshet, chalot, rikikim, the regular menachot in chapter 2, minchat kohanim, although this is a little bit debated, minchat kohen mashiach, minchat goyim, minchat nashi, minchat choteh. Most of the regular menachot require hagasha. Rabbi Shimon omer minchat kohanim, minchat kohen mashiach, ein behen hagasha. There's no formal process of hagasha for the mincha that's a kohen kind of mincha, because mifnei she'ein behen kmitza, right? There's no kmitza. Rabbi Shimon believes kmitza is the throwing of the handful onto the altar. So Rabbi Shimon thinks that hagasha is a predecessor to kmitza. You bring your offering to the altar, take a handful out, and then take the rest of the offering away from the altar. But to Rabbi Shimon, since the mincha of the Kohanim is all thrown onto the altar, so there's no really formal hagasha. You're bringing it, of course, to the altar, but there's no like process that we call hagasha. Okay, right, that's clear that Kohanim, mincha of a Kohen, and mincha offered by a Kohen is not eaten by anybody. It's all put onto the altar. That's straightforward in the pasuk. Elu tunin tnufa, ve'ein tunin hagasha. So these ones require waving, and these are not all just mincha. There are a few other things too that are waved, but they're not presented. And some of these are just straightforward reading from the pasuk. So I'll just example, log shemen shel mitzora ve'ashamo. So the oil that the person with skin disease brings, the mitzora, here you can see it straightforward in the pasuk. Ve'lakacha kohen et hakeves ha'echad v'hikrivo to le'asham. Right, that's for the mitzora. He brings a Hashem offering. Ve'ed log hashemen v'hinifo tam tznufa le'ifnei Hashem. Right, the keves, the lamb, and the log, the oil, are waved in front of God. But there's the word v'higish isn't used there. Right, they're not presented; they're just waved. V'habikurim Kedivrei Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. This is a little strange, right? The bikurim here are first fruits, regular first fruits, not minchat bikurim, but bikurim, right? The first fruits you bring, and that is there in Mishnah Bikurim. Higia la'arami oved avi. He's reading the parsha. He's brought, right? This is the parsha we're familiar with from the Pesach Seder. Morid hasal me'al ktefo. I'm reading from the Mishnah Bikurim. He takes the basket off of his shoulders, ve'ochazo bisfatav. He holds it by its edges, not his lips, right? That would be hard to hold the basket with your lips. He holds the basket by the basket's lips. The kohen maniach yado tachtav, and we have like a joint waving. The individual owner and the kohen who's helping him put his hands underneath him, and minifo waves the basket. Right, and he reads, as he's waving the basket, he would read the Ami Oved Ovi. What I don't really know where it's coming from, this I haven't figured out, is why this is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is not mentioned in that Mishnah. According to our Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov holds this, but somebody else doesn't hold that. Right? The Hanafa there is not in the Torah itself. Right? In other words, if something is there in the Torah, no rabbi is going to really disagree with it. If it says v'hinif, no one's going to disagree with it. But for the Arami Oved Avi, it doesn't say in the Torah itself that he brings, does tnufa. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says that he does, and evidently everybody else says he doesn't. But this is an unusual form in the Mishnah to say kedivrei so-and-so without bringing a machloket. We don't get, it happens other times, but it's unusual. It's like interesting, I think, that occasionally the Mishnah seems to allude to other Mishnah that we don't have, right? Which is not all that surprising because, right, the Mishnah is a pretty large book and probably was edited over a long period of time. And it's not all that clear that every Mishnah lines up perfectly well with every other Mishnah from every other Masechet, right? Just doesn't work that way. Okay, which gives the Gemara a lot to talk about. All right, ve'emorei shalmei yachid v'chazeh v'shok shelahen. So the emorim are the innards that are burned on the altar, and this is an individual voluntary offering, and then you get here in the chazeh and the shok are right there specifically in here. Yadav tiviena et ishe Hashem et acherev al chazeh yiveenu hachazeh, and elsewhere that's the chazeh is the breast. Elsewhere the shok is mentioned as well. Lehanifo tam tnufa Hashem. Okay, the cherev is part of the innards. Okay. Echad anashim v'chadashim b'Yisrael avalo ba'achirim. Non-Jews who bring a shlamim offering don't have them waved. Okay, women and men, Jewish women and women do, but non-Jews do not. Okay, ushtei halechem ushnei kifsei ha'atzeret. The two loaves that go with on Shavuot, and the two lambs that go on Shavuot, which we've talked about a few times. This is straight there in the pasuk over here, right? Vehenif hakohen otam al lechem habikurim. Lechem habikurim here refers to the shtei halechem. Tznufa lifnei Hashem al shnei kvasim. On top, literally, as we're going to see in a second, on top of the two lambs, right? Kodesh yeh Hashem kohen. Okay, so the Mishnah asks, Ketzad, how does he do this? What is the particular instructions for the lambs and the loaves of bread? Noten shte halechem al gabe shnei kvasim. He literally puts them on top of the lambs. I believe that they're no longer alive at this point. Umaniach shte yadav lamata, puts his hands below. Molich umovi, right, brings them forward and backwards. Ma'aleh umori, up and down. Okay. Shenemar asher hunaf va'asher huram. Right. Hunaf is to bring forward and backwards, wave, and huram is to raise, that we're raised, and raising implies that they're lowered as well. That's a verse that you get from the in Shmot Kaftet. It's not. This is about a different offering, but the rabbis apply it. It's not about the shtei lechem or the shnei kivsei atzeret. Asher hunaf asher huram mi'el hamiluim. Right, that's the special miluim offering. The one where they dedicate the altar. But the rabbis apply it to all cases of tnufa. Tnufa hayta b'mizrach v'hagasha b'marav. Different areas of the altar. You probably got this a little bit in Zevachim. You get it throughout the Mishnah. Different things occur in different areas of the altar. The altar is very large. Some are in the east, some are in the west. So waving is done in the east, and presenting is done in the west. Utsnufot kodem lahagashot. If something requires both waving and presenting, first you wave and then you bring it to the altar. So you would start on the east and move around to the west. Minchat ha'omer, and specifically which one requires both? Minchat ha'omer. Okay, that is, we saw that over here. I think that's in, right, Vayikra Kaf Gimel and Vayikra Zayin. No, Vayikra Kaf Gimel. Minchat ha'omer u'minchat knaot is the sota. Tunot tnufa vehagasha. Right, you can see that best in the one about the sota. V'lakach al goen miyad ha'isha et minchat ha'knaot v'hinif et mincha lifnei Hashem. There's hinif. V'hikriv ota al hamizbeach. Hikriv is to draw near, right, to bring it near. So they both require both. And then you get two things that don't require either. Lechem hapanim uminchat nesachim lo tnufa v'lo hagasha. So lechem hapanim is never brought to the altar. The showbread is not brought to the altar. And the mincha that goes along with the korbanot, the animal korbanot, it's not waved and it's not formally presented on its own because it's just combined sort of together with the animal. So it doesn't have any act of formal presentation separately from the animal offering. Okay, I think maybe we are going, I want to skip a little bit, right? It's getting very technical. We're not going to get very far. I just thought I'll skip around a couple things I thought were interesting. Mishnah 8. Ha'omer harei alai b'mechavat lo yavi b'marcheshet. Right? So the rabbis, when they want to, a lot of times when they want to define something, they do it in the context of nidarim, of dedicatory vows, right? Because when it comes to dedicatory vows, you have to be precise, right? 100% precise. So if you look for instance, if you've learned Mishnah Nadarim, Mishnah Nadarim is largely, I think except for the first 2 chapters, it's largely about defining things. Right? What do certain things, when you make a neder not to go into someone's house, for instance, can you go into their backyard? Okay. If you're not going to eat their food, can you drink their drink? Right? Things like that. Right? What is included in terminology? That's just the way the rabbis, right? They don't have like dictionaries, but they use nidarim to illustrate what words mean. Because rabbis like to talk about consequences, not just definitions. So ha'omer harei alai b'mechavat. If someone says, I'm going to bring a mincha offering in a machavat, right? These are 2 words found in Vayikra Zayin, 2 different kinds of mincha offerings. So if someone says, I want to bring in a machavat, lo yavi b'marcheshet, you can't bring in a marcheshet. And vice versa, b'marcheshet lo yavi b'machavat. Which means that, like, lest you think that kol hanaseh b'marcheshet v'al machavat are the same thing, they're not. They're 2 different things. Right? Now, what's interesting here is there's a machloket about what the difference between these 2 are. I made a little note over here, is that it's interesting that like not that long after the destruction, I mean, 100 years on the one hand is not that long, and then it's like a really long time, right? 100 years, think about like 100 years ago, we're talking like 1925. That's a different era. But when we look back in ancient history, we tend to think, oh, the year 55, the year 155, well, that's all kind of the same period, but clearly not. 100 years after the destruction of the temple, there's debates. We've seen this throughout the Mishnah about what's going on in the Beit HaMikdash. And this is an example. Ma bein mechavat lemarcheshet. What's the difference between these two vessels? Marcheshet yesh la kisui, v'machavat ein la kisui. A marcheshet has a cover, and a machavat doesn't have a cover, right? Probably one, if you have a cover, it's going to be a little more steamed, a little less fried, and without a cover, it's just kind of a frying pan. That's Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Rabbi Hanania ben Gamliel omer marcheshet amuka umaseha rochashim. So a marcheshet is deeper, and its product is going to be looser. Rochashim means looser. Umachavat safa umaseha kashim. A machavat is like, it's lower, right? Not so deep, it's much lower. And what you make in a machavat is going to be harder, right? Which means Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Hanania ben Gamliel, everybody agrees that these are two different things, but they don't know exactly what the difference between them is because they're living, Rabbi Yossi Aglili certainly lived at least 100 years, right, after the destruction of the temple. Quite a bit of time. All right, now we get the same thing with a tanur. Ha'omer hare alai betanur. Right?
Excuse me, did they come to a conclusion?
No conclusion. That's very typical, right? Mishnah is a machoket. We don't know who's right, right? I guess.
Did they discuss this in the Gemara?
Maybe, I don't know. I don't know all of Menachot, but I certainly don't know all of Menachot by heart. Usually here's what happens when it comes to halacha. First of all, when you've got something like Hilchot Beit HaMikdash, most medieval poskim don't paskin Hilchot Beit HaMikdash, right? The Rif just completely left it out, right? The major poskim, the Ashkenazi poskim, they don't like. There's no Hilchot Beit HaMikdash in the Shulchan Aruch or in the Torah. They just didn't write halachic books on that stuff. The Rambam is
the Rambam. Yeah,
Rambam is a big exception. So I don't know how the Rambam decides over here. The Rambam is a big exception, and it's interesting because usually the Rambam paskins after the Rif, right? 95% of the time. Rif is 2 generations before the Rambam. Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, he lives in northern
Africa,
right? And he is highly, highly influential in halacha. And he does not have anything what he calls hilchot de Mashiach, or anything the halacha that only be relevant in the time of the Mashiach. So he leaves out large portions of the Gemara. The Rambam paskins the entire Gemara, right? Including things that like laws of the land of Israel. Those are the ones that became very important when Jews began to return to the land of Israel. The only real halachic code. There's a little bit here. Look, there's Perushim of the Mishnah from Ashkenazi Rishonim. Wrote Perushim of the Mishnah. The Mishnah appears in the Mishnah from, let's say, Zraim or Kodashim, appears in the Gemara. But they didn't write halachic books, right? The Ashkenazi Rishonim didn't really write many halachic books anyway. But the Torah is really the first classic, fully comprehensive one. He doesn't have any of this stuff in there. So it's a little hard to know. I don't know this off the top of my head. I could look it up. The Rambam's sort of flying on his own and has to make up his own decisions over here, which is difficult, right? Like, sometimes there's criteria. Rabbi Yossi Aglili is more, gets to the halacha like him more than Rabbi Hanania ben Gamliel. But Rabbi Hanania ben Gamliel is not a frequently appearing Tana. Rabbi Yossi Aglili appears all the time. I don't know off the top of my head who the halacha is according to, but for the most part, no, not for the most part. No one has done this in 2,000 years. So unless there's a return to the Beit HaMikdash and a return to the sacrificial service, this isn't really a happening.
It's moot.
It's moot. Yes, for the time being, it is moot.
May I say something?
Yes, you can say something.
The Rambam didn't always come to a decision either in this halacha stuff. There were times when he kind of threw up his hands about it also.
Yeah, I think most of the time he does. Nothing's 100%, but most of the time he does, right? He may sometimes say there are different customs, and some people hold this way and some people hold that way, which is a way of saying both parties have legitimacy. But just to say without, and not in such cases, he usually comes up with a decision, right? Again, in cases like this, it's not all, it's not quite as necessary, right? Because this is not realistic. It's not happening anymore. All right. Haomer hare alai betanur. So this is another kind of Vayikra refers to a mincha in an oven. So the question is like, what is an oven? Right? You might even have that today. I mean, obviously, you didn't have microwaves, but could you bake your mincha in a microwave? Right? Obviously, that's kind of silly, but like you may have the question of like, if for Hilchot Shabbat, they had the question of, is cooking a microwave considered cooking? It is, by the way, right? You can't cook in a microwave on Shabbat, right? But they had to at least discuss it. It wasn't muvan me'ila, right? There's no heat in your microwave. And maybe you might have thought, oh, the only way for it to be like strictly usher on Shabbat is to have a heat source, because most other forms of cooking are heating. In any case, tanur is not as clear as you might think. Even today, I think there are different kinds of ovens. What counts as an oven? So they explain it. And they use, again, a neder. I will bring a mincha in a tanur. Lo yavi ma'afeh kupach, u'ma'afeh ra'afim, u'ma'afeh yorot ha'aravim. So we get other forms of cooking. A ma'afeh kupach is a type of stove. In Shabbat, they refer to a kiraim, which is a stove where you cook on top, not inside. An oven is something they cooked inside. Bread was made in an oven like pita is today by putting on the sides. It wasn't usually baked. It was just slapped on the sides. Okay, so a ma'afeh kupach is something on top of the oven. You can bake bread that way, right? You can take bread and put it into a pan and make bread, certainly if you cover it. I remember when I first got to Israel in 1990, a lot of people didn't have ovens in their homes. And they had something on top of the stove that they would use like as a makeshift kind of oven. As a source heat, basically the range would be below and you would have a stove above. Nowadays, everybody I know has a real oven. So that's a kupach. Re'afim are hot tiles, right? Another way to make bread would be to heat up a tile very, very hot and slap a piece of like rolled out dough on top of it. And if you turn it over on both sides and it's thin enough, it'll cook really quickly. That's not an oven. Yorot ha'aravim are like ovens carved out into the ground. People would dig holes in the ground. They would like probably line up coals around. Like you could do this without anything, right? You put some like, I mean, I've never done it, but I can imagine it quite easily. You put a heat source around, then you cover it with some dirt, you cover it with some plaster, right? And then you've got very, very hot sides. You don't need to build clay. You just need some coals and some plaster, and you slap some stuff on the side and you can bake. But that doesn't count as an oven according to the Mishnah, because that's like, even they call it an Arab. The word is Arab, but Arab, by the way, in the Mishnah usually means shepherds, right? They're like certain, like probably closer to what we think of as like Bedouins, right? Like it's not the same kind of thing, identity as an Arab identity that we have today. When they're using the word Arab, they usually mean some kind of shepherd, nomadic peoples. Rabbi Yehuda Omer im ratzah yavi ma'afeh kupach, right? He can bring the kupach. That's the one hold range, like a stove kind of thing. All right, I'm going to skip that next little part over here. I wanted to do there was one part I wanted to do that I thought was interesting. Oh, here. I'm just going to skip a lot over here. There's a lot of measures here, right? I think it's a little bit interesting just to see like some midrash that becomes undebated by the rabbis about the Todah. Okay, and it's not all that clear where it comes from. This is derived midrashically in the Gemara. By midrashically, I mean it's like derived in a way that we would not read as the simple reading of the Torah. It's derived by wordplay, by comparisons, things like that, but not something that would be readily apparent to someone who just reads the Torah in a pshat way. So on Im ala todah yakrivena. So if he's bringing a korban for Thanksgiving for something, meaning the korban you're bringing, the animal korban you're bringing is for Thanksgiving. This is from Vayikra Zayin. V'hikriv al zevach hatodah. Now, on the zevach todah, on this todah Thanksgiving offering, you have to bring the following, and I color-coded it a little bit here to help. Chalot matzot brurot v'shemen, right? That's matzah cakes, right, with oil. Rikikei matzot meshuchim b'shemen. Note the difference here in the terms. You've got the chalot are mixed or soaked with oil, and then you've got rikikim are thinner wafers, right? They call them, right? In the translation, that are spread with oil. The rabbis talk about that. The chi, right? You get a little Greek letter with a chi on it, kind of cool. Nowadays, I can make a little joke, right? Nowadays, we call it X, and it used to be Twitter chalot, and now it's X chalot. That's a little Twitter joke. All right. Solet murbechet is cakes of solet murbechet chalot brurot b'shemen, right? That's actually, I don't think I should have put this in two colors, right? That's cakes of choice flour with oil mixed in, well soaked. Murbechet means that there's water in there, well soaked. And along with that, al chalot lechem chametz. On top of that, you've got chametz, right? This has to be a different set because the rest of them seem to be matzot, right? And these ones are chalot. So the rabbis read into here, which this I think is the pshat, is there are arba minei lechem. There are 4 different kinds of lechem. Rashi, I just brought Rashi over here, counts them out. And he points out, v'chol v'min v'min eser chalot. Every one of them has 10 chalot, which means that you bring 40 chalot with your Toda offering. And then he says, Kach meforash b'menachot. That's how it explains it in Mishnah Menachot or in Gemara Menachot. Rashi kind of uses that to hint that like that's not explicit in the Torah. The 4 different kinds is explicit in the Torah. That you bring 10 loaves of each is not explicit in the Torah. And that's the way I think Rashi sort of hints. When he wants to say something is not the pshat, he'll say, I learned that from the Gemara, right? Or from the Midrash, right? He says that quite a bit. He's aware what's pshat and what's not. All right, I wanted to look at, there's a lot of, like we said before, there's a lot of details and we're going to run out of time. I thought this was interesting, 5 and 6 over here. Ha'omer harei alai todah. So somebody who says, I am going to bring a Toda offering, okay, which now means he has an obligation to bring a Toda offering. A Toda offering is a voluntary offering. You don't have to bring it, right? You should, right? If you want to celebrate, getting out of jail, crossing the sea, getting saved from something dangerous, right? You might want to bring a Todah, but it's not a mandatory. But the second you say, Ha'omer harei alai Todah, that I'm obligated to bring a Todah, now you have an obligation. And the important thing to remember with obligations is you can't use ma'aser sheni money to fulfill an obligation. Right? Maaser, the idea of Maaser Sheni money is the following. People will separate their second tithe, and they have to use the money in Yerushalayim to buy food products, and it's supposed to la'ater et shvakot Yerushalayim, to make the shuk there wealthier, right? To force people, right? In a sense, it's a little bit like it catches the spirit of like, well, what is Jerusalem? Jerusalem is a city to which people came not for primarily for business, right? Even to this very day, if you want to have for business, you generally are going to go to Tel Aviv, right? Certainly in the ancient world, not just Tel Aviv, but you're going to go to the port cities, right? Where transportation is much easier. Jerusalem is it's not extremely unique. You can't be extremely unique. It's unique. I don't like it. I don't like adjectives going around unique because you can either be unique or not unique. But I don't know if it's 100% unique. But it's different because it's not a city on a water source. There's no rivers going to Jerusalem. You go throughout most of the United States or Europe. Most of the major cities are either on coasts or on rivers because before the train, you couldn't get products to cities unless you had a source of water which you could travel. So I don't know, I'm in Chicago, there's a big river here over here, and there's a big lake. I was in Toronto, big river. You go through Ohio, you've got big rivers. Go throughout all of America, big rivers, obviously in Europe. Jerusalem doesn't have that. So how did they get financial success for people living in Jerusalem? And to this day, you get people visiting there for religious reasons. So they were supposed to separate their Maser Sheni wherever they were, and then they could turn it into coins. And then when you bring it to Jerusalem, you can't use it to fulfill something that you have another obligation for. So if you did a sin and you have to bring a chatat offering, you can't use it there to buy chatat because you had to bring your chatat anyway. It's like you can't double dip, if you will, right? I don't know. I'm trying to think. It's like counting two exemptions on your taxes. You get to count them once and not twice. That would be fraud. So if you have an obligation now to bring a todah, you have to yavihi v'lachma min hachulin. You have to bring it and its bread have to be brought from regular non-sacred money, not maaser sheni. Maaser sheni is sacred money. Todah. So if you say I'm going to bring the todah min hachulin v'lachma min hamaaser, but I'm going to bring the bread, the menachot from second tithe money. Yavihi v'lachma min hachulin. You bring both of them again from chulin, from non-sacred money, because you can't have the maaser is secondary to the todah, right? The lechem. The bread is secondary; it's ancillary to the todah. However, if you say todah mina maaser, v'lachma mina chulin, if I'm going to bring the todah from the maaser and the lechem from non-sacred produce, that's okay. That's yavi. In other words, if you make a vow that I'm going to bring the todah from maaser money, then you never had an obligation to bring a todah from non-maaser money. You immediately, let's say this again. If you create for yourself an obligation to bring a todah, you can't use maaser money because maaser money doesn't go for obligatory things. But if from the very time you create an obligation, you make it from maaser, so you never had an obligation to bring a todah from anything except for maaser, and so that works. Right? Then you can bring it from your maaser money and can save you some money. When you, let's say you're in Ashkelon, something good happens to you want to bring a todah, but you also have maaser sheni money. So you would say, Harei alai todah mina maaser, right? That works. And then if you want to bring the lechem from chulin, well, that you're always allowed to bring. Okay? I'm probably sure you could bring the lechem even from maaser sheni money because the lechem goes with the todah, not the other way around. Hatoda vahi v'lachma mina maaser yavi. And all the more so if you say both of them are going to be from maaser, that you can bring because you can never create an obligation to bring anything from anything but maaser. V'lo yavi michitei maaser sheni ela mimaot maaser sheni. An extra wrinkle is you don't bring from wheat, right? You can't just separate wheat, right? If you're going to bring the wheat, then from your maaser sheni, let's say you separated your wheat, you separated some to make it maaser sheni. You can't just turn that into a korban, right? Because that's maaser sheni. What you have to do is redeem that, turn it into money, bring the money to Yerushalayim, and the money you could use to buy lechem there, right? But you can't just sort of bake your maaser sheni into a korban. That doesn't work. All right, we'll do one last little Mishnah here, which is a good midrash. Minayin lo omer harei alai todah lo yavi ela min hachulin. So where do we get this? Well, how do we know this? Right? You can't bring except from non-sacred produce, not from maaser sheni. Shenemar v'zavachta pesach Hashem Elokecha tzon uvakar. You shall sacrifice a pesach to God, small flock animals, small sheep or goats, right, or a herd. Right? That's a problem. That is one of the most problematic psukim in the entire Torah because Shemot clearly says you have to bring the pesach from tzon and not from bakar. And then you get to Devarim and it says tzon ubakar. And the Mishnah is very well aware of this problem. The pesach has to be either a lamb or a goat, not a cow. There's no such thing as a cow pesach offering. Why does Devarim say tzon uvakar? By the way, biblical critics have heyday with this. Like, this is a very big topic. when people talk about contradictions between Devarim and Shemot. The rabbis obviously do not read this as a contradiction. They read it as alluding to something else. So why does Devarim say tzon uvakar? El hakish, to make a comparison. Kol haba mina makar umina tzon lepesach, right? So it compares anything that comes from cattle to, or from or small cattle, tzon, flock animals, to the Pesach. Maha Pesach shehu ba bechova. Pesach is a mandatory offering. Eino ba ela mina chulin. You can't use for a mandatory offering maser sheni. It has to be non-sacred funds used to buy your Pesach offering. Kol davar shehu ba bechova. Anything that's mandatory, lo yavo ela mina chulin. It can only be used non-maser sheni money, not sacred money. Right? This is what I've been saying all along, and the rabbis are deriving it from a pasuk. Lefichach haomer harei alei todah. Someone who says, "I'm going to bring a todah. I have the obligation to bring a todah. Harei alei shlamim, or I'm going to bring shlamim offering. Ho'il vehem ba'im chova. Since they're now mandatory, you've turned a voluntary offering by using a vow. You've turned a voluntary offering into a mandatory offering. If you just want to bring a voluntary offering, just bring it. Don't say I'm obligated. You just bring it to the Beit HaMikdash without saying anything. That's fine, right? Or you could just say this is a shlamim. This is a todah, not harei alai. I have an obligation. That turns it into a mandatory. Vehem ba'im chova lo yavo mina chulin. They can lo yavo ela mina chulin. It can only come from non-sacred money. So too, all the libation offerings, since they're mandatory, right? They're not in themselves, they're mandatory, but once you bring an animal sacrifice, you've mandated to bring the libations. So the libations are now mandatory. And mandatory things can only be bought with non-sacred funds, not with Maser Sheni. All right. I think we did pretty good today. Yeah, you feeling good? I think we got through some stuff. Like I said, this is very hard material. We haven't had a full array of classes, but kol kavod, Debbie, to you and Rebecca for learning this material.
Can I ask you, why is it non-sacred funds?
Maser Sheni is considered Kodesh.
No, I understand that, but why is the mincha not from it?
It's not. You can bring a voluntary offering from second tithe money. But when you turn your mincha into a mandatory offering, right, by saying, I am obligated to bring this, then you can't use second tithe money. Second tithe money can only be used for voluntary offerings. For the most part, this would be something like the Pesach. The Pesach's a mandatory offering because Jews have to bring a Pesach.
Because it is.
Yeah.
Right.
Not because you made it into one, because it's inherently one. So that's the easiest example. Or a bachor. No, a bachor is not something you would buy. But like the Pesach's the easiest example. It's a mandatory offering. So you can't like double use. The idea of second tithe money is to supplement the things that you had to bring. You've got things you have to bring, and then we supplement it with second tithe to bring more money into Jerusalem. You can't double dip that. You can't use the second tithe to use for mandatory.
Cover something else. In other words, you're going there anyway, so you figure I'll take care of two things with one stone.
Right. You'll be saving yourself some money. With the second tithe, you can only buy voluntary things, right? It's imagine, I don't know, like maybe this is not a great example, but like if I'm making a donation to a nonprofit organization, I can't use it for like, let's say I make a donation to summer camp. I can't use it for the tuition for my kid for summer camp because this is not a donation. The tuition is mandatory and the donation is voluntary.
Right.
So that would be a tax violation. Not a bad example. My father-in-law, who is a accountant, will be proud that I know a little bit about tax law. So, all right, everybody have a Chag Sameach.
Thank you.
See everybody on October 19th, and thanks for coming and happy.
Thank you so much.
Also enjoy Sukkot
Yes,
wherever you are.
All right, take care, everybody.
And let's pray that the hostages get to enjoy some of Sukkot here in Israel.
Amen.
Yes.
Amen.
Amen.
One scheduling note. First, as Rabbi Kulp said, we are not meeting on Chol HaMoed. We are not meeting on the 12th. Class will resume on the 19th. And second, Registration for Fallsman classes is open, including Hulin, the next class in this Mishnah in-depth series, which will continue at the same time, Sundays, 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern US. I hope to see you all.
With whom?
It is with Rav Avi Wolfish.
Thank
All
you.
right, take care, everybody. Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Yeshkaya. Chag
Ta-da.
Sameach.